Hello people and welcome back to another Fantasy Author Lounge. I took a little bit of a break for some summer adventuring, but I am back, and in this month's lounge I've got an incredibly fascinating person for you to listen to. He's known as Christian Cameron in the wider book world. You might know him from the fantasy genres as Miles Cameron. In any case, he's the author of over 40 books in 4 different genres. He's an avid reenactor, a bottomless pit of facts and knowledge, and he's pretty frickin' lethal with an Italian longsword, let me tell you.
Christian Cameron, a warm welcome to the Fantasy Author Lounge. It's great to have you here. How are you doing this fine day?
I'm doing great, Ben, and thanks for having me. It is a fine day here too, which is amazing that from Victoria to Toronto we've managed to. And look, it's Canadian fantasy authors uniting.
I know. We haven't done this before in the lounge as well. It's always been either US, UK, Germany on one occasion as well. So yeah, the Great White North runs the lounge this week.
you know, you need to get Evan Winter too. He's really fun. If you haven't chatted with Evan Winter.
He seems incredibly busy, seeing so much success. But yeah, I'd love to get Evan in the lounge.
He's successful, but really, really nice. I'll admit. Anyway, let's go on. It's about me. It's all about me today.
That's it. It's your lounge. Well, like I said, it's great to have you here. We were just chatting before hitting the record button, but yeah, haven't seen each other since Dublin Worldcon last year. And yeah, it was great to meet you then. And I'm sure loads of people out there who have read your books and want to know more. So why don't you tell us all about yourself, your books, your history, bank account details, the whole lot.
Yeah, well, okay. I'll start with the bank account details. Wow, my history. I'm from upstate New York. I grew up in a fairly small town, went to a fairly small high school, went to a really excellent university, which was really very pivotal for me, and I would talk about for hours if you let me. Joined the US Navy, spent quite a while in the Navy, and you know, I did medieval history for my degree, and I feel like somehow writing crept me back to it. Nice. And the romantic version of the story of my life, because I could tell a nastier version, is that having fallen in love with a Canadian, I had to find a job that I could do while illegally in Canada, and that turned out to be writing. I could make a smarter version of that, but yeah, the nice thing about writing is it crosses many borders, as you might know yourself, Ben.
That's it. Yeah, I've snuck into Canada. Hopefully they'll keep me here, but no, I think that is quite a romantic tale. I like that. And it worked, obviously. Yeah. Paid dividends.
Yeah. If only it was true. But anyway, here we all are. Yeah, I write. I love to write. I've now written more than 40 books. I've lost count.
Mind-boggling. Yeah, that's a chunk. And also across 4 different personas. Well, three different personas, but kind of 4 different genres, from historical fiction, fantasy, sci-fi now, and also thriller as well in the past.
Yeah, so do spy novels. And in fact, I could make you a claim that the spy novel content runs as the constant through all of them, right? I wrote 8 spy novels with my dad as Gordon Kent when I was still basically a functioning intelligence officer myself, and I was pretty fresh at the game. First couple had to be sent to a security officer to be read before they could go out the door, which was hilarious. But again, a publishing nightmare.
I can imagine. Yeah, that's a gate I don't think my books would ever.
No, I want you to imagine going to the copy edit phase and then having to send the whole book to someone who can now go like, you can't have that whole chapter.
Oh, no, classified.
Yeah, good fun. Even in my fantasy novels, you know, if you look carefully, you'll always find a couple of intelligence officers and some cynicism.
Interesting. That's excellent. A good running theme to have.
Spying has been described by people brighter than me as a zero-sum game. And I think that that's sometimes a useful message to get across in the sort of dashing sword and sorcery world of fantasy and even science fiction.
So when did you branch into the fantasy side and start writing as Miles Cameron? Because that's how I first came across you, actually.
Well, I'm going to tell you the history of publishing according to Christian Cameron / Miles Cameron, which is once upon a time, Tom Clancy invented the thriller. Now, that's not really true, but like this is my mythological history. And people who knew how the beans and bullets of intelligence, aircraft carriers, and tanks worked could make a lot of money writing thrillers. So we did. And then 9/11 happened, and everyone decided that actually Jack Ryan had not saved anyone from the terrorism threat, and everybody stopped reading thrillers. Now, again, that's not literally true, but in my mythological history. So I decided I'd go re-educate myself and finish my degree in classics. And I went and started to take classical Greek. And I fell so deeply in love with classical Greek civilization that I wrote a book, which did as well or better than any of my science fiction thrillers. And so suddenly I was all about historical fiction. I wrote a bunch of historical fiction. And then the truth is that what I read is fantasy novels. I've always read fantasy from age 11 to the present. There's never been a time I didn't read fantasy. So I kept bugging. See, I was writing for Orion, historical publisher. And I kept going, and if you read any of those novels, there's a lot of supernatural, dreams come true, the Greek gods are sort of real. And that was me like always trying to get the screwdriver in, edging towards fantasy. Although, to be honest, I find it very hard to write about the past without, how can I put it, telling the story the way they at least must have thought the world worked. Like, I hate modernizing to the point where like everyone's an atheist and you go, but they built those big temples. Someone.
For some reason.
So somewhere in there, literally, I was talking to my rather excellent editor at Orion, and Gillian Redfern walked into his office. And Bill said to me, you know, I hear you've always wanted to write a fantasy novel. Give Gillian a pitch. And I'm like, okay, Gillian, like, no pressure.
Right there.
5 seconds, tell a famous editor what I need for a fantasy novel.
Not send an email, not let's have coffee in a couple of days, there and then.
Right there and then. And I hadn't been prepared for it at all. And in fact, I just kind of been in a riding accident in Greece, so my hip hurt.
Right.
And so I came up with an idea. I say this to all the fantasy authors and would-be fantasy authors. I came up with an idea that wasn't bad. And she immediately responded like a week later, 5 days later, anyway, with a sort of like take my idea, embroider on it idea that was better than my idea. And then like 2 weeks later, I was on a long car ride and I had the idea, which was better than her idea and better than my original idea, but incorporated massive parts of both her idea and my idea, which became The Red Knight.
Brilliant.
And so that was my fantasy career, to which I totally give credit to Gillian Redfern. Like, and she bought it and she immediately sold it on. I wrote one scene, which if you've read it is the combat scene with the first wyvern, where the company takes on the wyvern.
With the inspiration for the cover, isn't it?
And based on that one scene, she sold it at the London Book Fair to a bunch of, you know, French and German and whatever. So that was good.
So cool.
And okay, so here's my, are we giving writing advice? Is this a writing advice?
Absolutely.
lounge?
Yeah, this is for writing, this is for marketing, anything.
So write what you know. I know that everyone in the world says that, but I know a lot about arms and armor and a fair amount about medieval combat. And
You do.
a lot of people seem to have found a realistic description of fighting a wyvern with medieval weapons and armor to be like something they would pay money for. Literally, I mean, I'm not really flattering myself here, but like, it didn't take much of a sell job. Anyway.
That's fantastic.
So that's fantasy. And then, you know, the other thing I read besides fantasy is science fiction. You know what I don't read? Historical fiction. Like, I now read some historical fiction because there are people like you I've met, you know, at cons or whatever, and they turn out to be great people and they write well. So now I read them because I like them, like Simon Turney. I don't usually read historical fiction. And the reason is that I am such a history nerd that I can get wrecked in one page. A fairly famous, I shall not say this person's name, but a fairly famous historical novelist who makes way more money than me, on the first or second page of the novel I was handed of this person's to read, had Julius Caesar putting his foot in a stirrup to mount a horse, and I was done. And that's why I don't read historical fiction, because I don't read fantasy novels that way. I don't, you know, you give me a fantasy novel and my belief was suspended a week ago. Like I'm in. Sure, everything's made of everything's made of jade and nothing ever breaks. Cool, good.
Doesn't matter. Yeah. Fantasy, doesn't matter.
you said it. I'll go with it.
That's it, yeah.
And but you tell me that this is Genghis Khan. He better be fucking Genghis Khan.
That's it.
And that's like a thing. Anyway,
I completely understand that.
And then later on we'll talk about artifact space and how I got into science fiction. I'll leave that as a hook to keep people watching.
The master storyteller at work already, even on video. Well, let's dig into the history then, because, even before I met you, I knew you as an avid historian, obviously from your historical fiction books, but as well as, things you post on social media, but also an avid reenactor of many different historical, I would say, periods and events as well. And I just, where did you make the kind of leap from maybe studying the classic and Greek history up to actually fully reenacting it? Where did that love come from?
Other way around. So when I was 14, the American Bicentennial started, and my Boy Scout troop decided to rebadge themselves as historical reenactors, being a local militia group.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that led to 35 years of deep, deep devotion to the American Revolution, a subject about which I probably know way too much. Anyway, and after deep diving into the American Revolution and learning a ton, and I think people overuse the term experimental archaeology, but at the same time, I got to meet some fantastic real historians who kind of cruised around the edges of reenacting and went like, tell me exactly how you make a fire. Why do you make a fire that way? Would you be willing to dig your fire pit like this painting, which happens to be a picture of a British Revolutionary War fire pit? Could we experiment with exactly how the cook pot fits in the, anyway, I found all that totally fascinating. Yeah. So by the time I went to university, it was reenacting that, I got a medieval history degree because I just joined the SCA and was starting to fight in armor. And I was so in love with all that. I'm like, screw it, I'm going to do medieval history as a degree, even though I've done nothing but marine biology up until this point.
Right. Yeah.
And
bit of a segue.
And that kind of worked out. But and I've always loved the fighting. I loved fencing. I sucked at boxing, but didn't need it.
You're in armor. It doesn't matter.
I'm not built for it. But and I did some Eastern martial arts, Aikido and Kendo, and in the end Iaido, which I really loved, even though it's really more ritual dance than what we call a martial art. But all that being said, I really like fighting, and I really like figuring out how fighting styles work. I don't really like hurting people. No. I hope
it's more the
no, but I like, but
I'm
super disgustingly competitive, and that I don't know, there's lots of people like me. That does not make me feel special or even good about myself, but it is true. So and in some ways, like, fighting in armor is like the ultimate competition in a way, and then in another way it's so dangerous that you cannot take it seriously. Like, you can't lose your temper or whatever. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. But in history, in my love of history, the reenacting came first, and then I backed into the academic.
Yeah, thing. For some reason in my head, I always thought it went around the other way. But that's really interesting.
The other feed, I mean, we were talking before this started, so I kind of know where we're going with this. But the other feed I want to say that I don't talk about a lot, and that I should. I was thinking about this the other day, talking to my wife, is that I largely grew up or summered on a farm. And our backfield was a pre-white contact Iroquois village. On a sunny day after a rainy day, which isn't that uncommon in upstate New York, you could walk up and down the rows of corn, and if you were lucky, you could find an arrowhead, or 2 or 5, or some beads. That made history real. Now, my uncle was a sort of amateur archaeologist, grave robber, whatever you want to say. I watched my daughter do this in Greece when she was about 6 years old. I watched her go to a museum, be kind of bored, and then go out behind our hotel and find an actual blackware potsherd from about 500 BC with a little painted face on it, and suddenly, like, that's not the museum. It's right there. Now it's in your hand. And those people really lived.
Yeah.
It's not bullshit. It turns out the past is real. Things happened then, right? And
Isn't that incredible? Wow.
and I think that happened to me at a really young age. I can't tell you that I remember an incident, but all those arrowheads in the field, somehow that's why I'm a writer.
It's an amazing journey, but I very much understand the history we have, even though we've probably got so much we have yet to uncover, even though we've discovered huge amounts of history. But there are so many stories, told or untold. It's just a wealth of stories. Of course, those stories happened, but it is to us, as time goes on, a story. I'd say, chatting to a lot of different fantasy authors, it's always mythology. Everyone always reads mythology, digs into mythology, and from there I find, history is the next step from that.
My mom was huge on Greek myths. Like she'd done classics in university. I remember her reading Greek myths, and I still have the book, like age 5 or 6, going like, these sound like terrible people, Mom. Like, holy crap. I'm pretty sure my Bronze Age novel that I'm writing right now was born in my, like, these were gods? Like, you would beat me silly for behaving like this.
Yeah.
Hey, I got a great idea. I think I'll go grab somebody else's wife and get her pregnant.
Yeah, some of the Norse myths because I grew up on a lot of fairy tales, obviously roots in Germanic myth and roots in Norse myth from there. One of the things that always surprised me was Odin being the hanging god, or one of his elements. So you would hang anything in sacrifice to him, or a lot of things that you wouldn't normally hang. And I found there was a scene actually in American Gods that speaks about that. I found it so haunting, and yet being rooted in Norse myth and perhaps Norse history as well. I love that sort of anything can happen in mythology. Hence why we had so many good chats in Dublin.
Yes, exactly.
Was it Ashurbanipal we were talking a lot about?
Yeah. That's right it's right where I am right now. And you're talking about Odin. Sorry, I follow a lot of people on Twitter, and some white nationalist put up a thing about return to the Norse gods, and I think it was Guy K put up a brilliant response saying, like, go ahead and appeal to Odin. Historically, these are some results.
Yeah, it is. People don't dig enough sometimes.
Your understanding of Norse mythology is equivalent to your understanding of COVID-19.
You're not wrong. And unfortunately, Twitter and Facebook seem inordinately full of those people right now. But that's an entire different lounge.
That is, different lounge. Back to fantasy.
That's the ranting lounge, yeah. So talking about, obviously, your love for history, and the reason you don't read historical fiction is because of inaccuracies and things like that. But is there anything, for instance, when it comes to arms and armor, that you do find in fantasy books that you're just thinking, is there a pet peeve there, or do you still just ignore it in a fantasy book?
So many, and yet I'm not as judgy as you might think. So like lots of things can turn me off, but this is the thing. Like, I talk to readers, mine, yours, be afraid. And the thing that I feel that writers need to be most afraid of is the moment when they break suspension of disbelief for their reader. Just as sort of wild example, I know a writer whose name shall not be mentioned, but who I very much admire, and who basically said, like, yeah, you know how I get through fight scenes? I say, then they had a fight. He's like, I'm never going to get into the nitty gritty because it's just not my thing. And hey, that is a completely legit, like, way of getting through it. And even though I'm kind of a super authentic guy, I'll tell you about one of the most terrifying pieces of fan mail I ever received, which was from an SAS officer in Australia who said, I love your books, but you and I both know he's wrong. I don't know, but apparently he does know that when you're actually killing somebody with a knife or sword, you don't think about how you do it. You just do it and then it's done. And he's like, your characters think about these things, but you and I both know that nobody thinks their way through a fight. And no, but it's a really good point, right? And a long time ago, an editor of mine said that no matter what genre you think you're writing, people want to be educated a little while they read.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
A little, keyword a little. They don't want to be lectured at, but if they can end a book going like, now I know a little more about sword fighting than I did before, that's okay. But I've also realized, and I'll tell you the name of somebody who actually does this, Patrick O'Brien. Patrick O'Brien writes historical fiction, probably the best, most accurate 18th century historical fiction with war in it ever written. And he never describes a fight, because his fighters are always in what modern combative martial artists call in the black. They, they're trained, they do the deed, the guy's dead, and the pistol is out of bullets.
Yeah.
They don't
Automatic.
worry about how that happened. And thinking about that, talking to people who have sadly experienced that level of violence, because I'm a researcher, has actually changed some of how I write fight scenes, and caused me to dwell more on the emotional reaction, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so now I'm finally going to answer your question. Let me tell you what drives me nuts in a fantasy novel. It's not bad fight scenes. It's not that you can't wear a silk sash over a velvet coat. I know you can't, because the grain of the velvet causes the sash to gradually rotate around your waist, and you just can't do that.
That's such a niche bit of information. I love that.
It's not people who don't understand how hunting works or how camping works, or don't know how hard it is to start a campfire in the rain. None of those things drive me nuts. I thought The Name of the Wind was one of the best books I'd ever read, and the fact that the author knows very little about how camping works, who cares? Fabulous book.
Let that go.
But what does drive me insane is falsity of character. There are, I don't know whether to call them memes, but there are character types that anybody who does the least bit of reading about, say, post-traumatic stress disorder knows that these things don't go together. Your hard-eyed killer doesn't have a heart of gold. He can't have a heart of anything. His life experience has inflicted on him an entire system of life, and that system of life does not include falling in love or being nice to Bob.
That means killing Bob.
I'm sort of exaggerating, but there are some. There are some. And then there are some cultural artifacts that always make me wince. Most of them have to do with the lives of women, and I just kind of go like,
yeah.
And then there's some horror that I don't really want to inflict on my readers, but I can't help but know it in my head. So, for instance, when cities get sacked, nobody ever wants to talk about just how absolutely horrible that was. But
sort of glorious entrance of troops to the ringing of bells and things like that.
Yeah. I don't think that's what happened. So that's another place where I go, stuff like that. On the other hand, there's lots of different types of fantasy, and I hate genreification. I hate I write gothic bloodbound fantasy. Oh, I write epic whatever. I read fantasy across the board, and it could have unicorns and elves, or it can have Jeanette Ng. Do you remember Jeanette Ng from
yeah, she won the award that year, actually, didn't she?
Yeah. But you might remember she hung out with us a couple times, and her fantasy novel is about Anglican missionaries dealing with fairies in the Victorian English world, and it's fantastic. And it doesn't have a sword fight anywhere in it. There's no suit of armor. There's no So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of types of fantasy. Your type and my type has battles and wizards. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but
it does. Yeah, plenty of them.
No, but I mean, that's what we do, and that's great. But what I'm trying to say is, aside from some tropes that I actually think are either racist, misogynist, or just bad humanism, aside from those tropes, I try to be no more judgy about your elves and wizards than about my elves and wizards, because it's fantasy.
Yeah, that's it. That is the beauty of it. Is I laugh about it and say fantasy is a great excuse, as if to cover sins, but actually I think it's an excuse to leave a few aspects of realism behind as a reader or as an author.
I will do a dangerous thing, which when certain people see this video, they will stop reading my books. I'll say, okay, there's one thing from a martial arts standpoint that it's a recurring, again, I don't know if meme is the right word, but it's like a motif from James Bond movies to fantasy novels. It does drive me insane. Okay. Here it is. The hero, no matter how skilled, in the final fight with the bad guy, has to be brutalized to the point of utter defeat, and preferably knocked down. Sometimes with the weapon knocked out of his hand. I'm thinking of a particular novel I read recently. And then my very favorite is when the bad guy then swings and somehow like sticks his sword in the dirt or misses his swing, and somehow in what we fighters call a single tempo, Bob retrieves his sword, gets to his feet, and sticks it in the other guy. That's like
I've done that.
That's like 5 tempos, right? I want you to just for fun as a writer, when you're off with me, I want you to lie on the floor of your living room with a broomstick next to you and see how long it takes you to get even to one knee and swing it into somebody's shin. Just try that and figure out how you survived to do that. Anyway, my experience, I don't understand. Is this a failure of my manliness? I don't understand why the bad guy has to like take it on the chin. The very first novel I wrote all by myself was a book called Washington and Caesar, American Revolution. And in the final fight scene, the hero, who's like, these are black loyalists in the American Revolution, by the way, who's like put a lot of time and effort into learning how to use a sword. And the other guy's a slave taker who is used to terrifying people with a bludgeon. Yeah. And the slave taker dies in like 5 seconds. And the editor is like, this isn't exciting enough. You need to rewrite it. And I'm like, in real fights, most real fights are over in about 5 seconds. And if one person is trained and one person is untrained, one of the very first things you learn as a trained person is how to kill untrained people.
Not wrong.
And, and the editor's like, but it's not as good, it's not as emotionally binding. I don't know. I don't find it emotionally binding when James Bond is beaten up for 40 seconds before he remembers that he has a gun.
It's coming.
Yes, I know who's winning this fight. Why don't we get on with this? What I do really enjoy, and I really enjoyed it in in the science fiction series, The Expanse, one of the protagonists is deadly. Have you ever seen The Expanse?
Seen series 1 and 2, yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the protagonists, one of the guys, he's like a killer. And I love the way they've written his character, but I also like how he basically just wins gunfights because he knows what he's doing and he's not emotionally involved. And so they make their climaxes differently. So their climaxes are about the team, not about the one guy's involvement. Yeah. And I think that I really like that. Anyway, there, I've shown you my deepest, darkest.
No, I'm sure readers will understand that. I find it's very similar to, I think, why we saw such interest in, for instance, the comic book world and the MCU Marvel universe, how the Avengers films and the team-ups, I mean, personally, not only were they more successful, but I found them incredibly entertaining, especially that one particular scene. It's in the end of Avengers 1, it's at the start of Avengers 2, and it's multiple ways through the Endgame and Infinity War. But it's the bit where it's a slow motion, all comes together. So, for example, in Age of Ultron at the start, they all bust over this military barrier at one point, all in a line along the camera. So you're like, Hulk, you got Thor, you got blah blah blah, and it's just that slow motion bit, and then they carry on doing it. And then the first one, it's the camera spinning around them, and they're all doing their thing, and it's just those moments. Even now, I'm thinking I get little hairs, and I think that's for me when you said it's the team and how certain things come together in almost like a dance or in some sort of choreographed, scene in a movie. I like that.
Yeah, I like the team better. I just think it's funny that you're using the Marvel universe. And the reason I say it's funny is that because of my daughter, about 5 months ago, I started watching all those movies. I'd never seen any of them before. I have never watched any of the Marvel movies. And then I started sort of marching through them this summer, and they're so good. The writing is so good. I love banter. I love writing it, and I love watching it.
Me too. Yeah.
And my limited actual real world violence experience is all about being on a team, and banter is how scared but brave people communicate that they're okay. Banter is about saying like, I'm just as scared as you are, Ben, but I'm not buckling, and you won't either, because I'll make a joke and you'll make a joke, and we'll
That's
both
it.
go like, okay, we're still doing
Yeah,
this.
that's it.
Um,
Love that.
and I just think that banter is real. I've heard people really do it.
Hmm.
It's so good for morale in a
Yeah.
dangerous situation. I probably would die for Bruce Willis.
There you
um,
go.
no, but I mean, if your squadron commander or whatever, I
Yeah.
had a squadron commander, can manage to crack a joke at the
Yeah.
right time, everybody kind of breathes and goes, "Oh, I guess I'm still here, right?" Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and somehow the Marvel writers capture all that so
Mm.
well that I should just stop writing. I don't need to write anymore. They've got the whole thing.
They've
Um,
done it. It's finished.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I am at the moment addicted to Agents of Shield. Deep nerd. Deep nerd.
Deep nerd. Yeah.
Yeah.
My girlfriend hates watching them. She occasionally will let me put one while she's doing something else now, or if she's out, I can watch it. And I catch her just looking over it. It's, the banterous bits. For instance, Thor Ragnarok, full of it. It's almost verging on comedic in places rather
Yes.
than an action film. And I think they did that, Taika Waititi did that, just that line perfectly. And Rachel, for instance, would be sat on her iPad or on the phone, and I see her just kind of looking up and then just a chuckle and things like that. And I think that's so universal to get someone into something, whether they hate sci-fi, fantasy, and things like that. So that's why I find a lot of humor and that sort of banter coming into my books all the time. I can't help it. Just all of my characters are snarky. It's just a world of sarcasm.
But snark is fantastic.
Get it? Yeah, that's it. Again, going back to my girlfriend, who is just brilliant for testing things on. It's not like she hates fantasy; it just does nothing for her. Same with sci-fi and comic books, and yet she's obsessed with Game of Thrones. And I'm like, so do you like dragons now? Do you like magic? Are you interested in watching more or reading more? And she said, no, it's purely for the gossip, as in, as they call it, the shade that's thrown by Cersei in this scene, and it's just the kind of the turning of the knife all through dialogue, and it's true, and it's the snark. Game of Thrones is powered by it. I think it's brilliant.
Game of Thrones is high school in armor.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, talking about armor and arms and things like that, I know you said you're fiercely competitive, so not in terms of a duel to the death, but because I was going to make you choose between your favorite historical period, and I thought that might be too hard of a question. Feel free to answer it if it's not. But if you had to go toe-to-toe with a historical figure for a friendly duel, who would it be?
It would be Geoffrey de Charny, probably the greatest knight of the Middle Ages. I'd probably last until we'd circled once and he hit me in the head. That'd be fine, because in the eyes of the world of chivalry, exchanging even one blow with Geoffrey de Charny would be the most extravagantly wonderful. Geoffrey de Charny died at Poitiers with the King of France's banner in his hand and 20 dead English knights around him.
That guy sounds like a badass. Yeah.
He was widely reputed. He was the head of the French military orders. He'd fought on crusade. He'd fought in Prussia. He'd done all the things. And he wrote a book on chivalry, which basically said, like, that the only way to do this is to do this. I'm not sure he was a nice person, but I'm quite positive he was the top literate fighting knight of the Middle Ages.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Would you have one in the fantasy world, for instance, of the characters you've read, if you go toe-to-toe with someone, let's say, forget about magical powers and things like that. Is there anyone in the fantasy world you'd love to have a duel with?
Yes, but I'm going to have to take you on a back in the day trip. I don't know if you have ever read any Fritz Leiber.
I have not much
and that's the problem, because
the Grey Mouser, isn't it?
Yes, the Grey Mouser, and I would definitely like to cross blades with the Grey Mouser. Very much one of the models of my young fencing life. And Fritz Leiber knew a lot about fencing, and he described his sword fights meticulously. And I just reread the first Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser book called Swords and Deviltry like 2 weeks ago, and suddenly went like, I've never had a good idea. I am copying Fritz Leiber's style. I thought I'd come up with this on my own. Anyway, yeah, definitely like to fence there. And then, the problem I have with fantasy novels is I read so many of them, and some of them leave very deep imprints but often it's not the fighting. So for instance, I could talk a good game about Lois McMaster Bujold. I love everything she's ever written, but there isn't like a fighter there that I'd really like to, go a few rounds with.
Yeah.
I could make a joke about my own books, and that is that most of the fighters in the Red Knight are actually people I know
Oh, wow.
whose names have only vaguely been changed. So I've fought with all of them.
That's good.
And there's a scene right at the beginning of the Red Knight where they're training, and Bad Tom gets the captain gets his arm around Bad Tom's neck, and Tom just slams him into a stone wall and drops him.
Yeah,
that happened to me with him.
Oh, you were the dropper. No, you were the droppee.
I was the droppee. I was slammed into a wall by a very good, very large friend after I got him in what I thought was a killing finishing position.
Oh.
He just shook me like I was a very small dog.
You weren't fighting the mountain, were you?
Kind of like that. I know. I'm trying to think of like other fantasy novel fighters that really turn me on. This is terrible. I think I'm bringing out my inner teenage boy, but I'd like a go at Conan.
Okay, yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah.
It's a friendly bout, right?
Yes, don't worry.
Yeah,
because he'd bring some barbaric moves, wouldn't he? He'd be kind of strength over finesse, I feel, with Conan.
Robert E. Howard is, like in our world, the world of George Floyd and Me Too. There's a lot to hate in Robert E. Howard.
Yeah,
but
different.
No, but I mean, this is a real problem for me in fantasy. I'm old enough to have read all those old dead white men, many of whom had terrible racial attitudes, serious misogyny. Some of them were really good writers. And then on the flip side of that argument, some of them didn't write a lot of misogyny and racism, like Fritz Lieber. So you go like, wow, see, even then there were some people who didn't need to go there. So that I no longer view Robert E. Howard as a poster child, but he did write some fun stuff.
He did, yeah. That'd be an interesting battle.
And the movie.
Yeah, the first one, not the one that came afterwards.
No.
No offense to Jason Momoa, but
the first movie was not too bad. And I mean, we're just fantasizing, right? It's not a I don't think you could have a friendly contest, but I'd like to at least see orcs.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to die fighting orcs, but there's a dichotomy in Tolkien that is borrowed again and again by all of us. I've done it too. This is not an accusation, but it's a dichotomy that doesn't make sense to me as a martial artist. So maybe if I could just engage a couple of orcs, I'd understand it, which is that they're terrifying, fast, and strong, but any one human being can kill like 20 of them.
Yeah. It's the chaff, isn't it? The chaff you need in the fantasy books. It's that kind of ubiquitous thing of just guards. If you need someone to kill, there's a guard somewhere. There's always a guard. Fun to try, wouldn't it? How useless are you? How quickly can I dispatch you?
Exactly. Like, and C.S. Lewis took Tolkien on in a letter and basically said, no good God would ever create a race that was cursed to evil. That's not possible. And so Tolkien then, because Tolkien was very theological, as C.S. Lewis was like, totally good point. Got to come up with some very, very elaborate justification for why orcs are the way they are. Of course, the justification is basically they're fallen elves.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa, so every one of the 20 orcs I just laid waste to is actually a cursed immortal? That seems unfair. And why isn't their martial arts better?
I know.
Because Tolkien is such a good writer. Some of the best banter is actually the orcs. Like,
oh yeah.
The two orcs who are hunting for Frodo and Samwise inside of Mordor are kind of hilarious.
I know. Yeah. Oh man. Well, I'll tell you what, let's round off then, as you promised, with the teaser that's kept everyone watching for this time. How does all of this from reenactment, I suppose I can see it from the thrillers, but how does all of this translate to your brand new book that's coming out, Artifact Space?
Well,
I have one. Can I tell you my idea? Because I noticed the ship on the cover, which we'll get up for everyone to see, looks like a sword, a dagger. It looks weapon-like. So I'm wondering whether there's some sort of,
Yeah,
I'll let
so
you say it,
that
but I have
that
an
point
idea.
that point is hit home again and again. And in fact, I sent the cover artist a picture of an Italian longsword held in a
Nice.
slightly stern-on position.
Yeah.
Uh, I've got like 8 Italian
I
longswords in my
bet.
house. It's my thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all totally true. But here's the story. So first of all, I'm a huge sci-fi fan, and I mean like space opera to hard science sci-fi, that kind of spectrum. I'm
Nice.
not a soft sci-fi person. I'm more of what people would call a hard sci-fi person. Um, Although again, like I said with fantasy, I probably read anything. You know, I just love to read. If stuff
Yeah.
crosses my desk, I read it.
Why not? Yeah.
Um, but anyway, I like spaceships, travel, exotic locations, and hopefully a big fight at some point. But it doesn't have to be the be all and end all. So like one of the best science fiction novels I can remember reading was called War Child. Came out, Canadian author, I don't know, 10 years ago. Anyway, and there was a war going on in the background, but it wasn't all about war. Good take. Anyway,
Yeah.
I sat next to Alistair Reynolds at Galan's Fest 4 years ago. And I was a fanboy because, man, do I love Alistair Reynolds. And he didn't want me to be a fanboy, which I now understand, because now that I actually have some fans, I understand that I'd like to meet them as people and I don't need their praise. You know, like
Yeah.
that's totally nice. Why don't we talk about you or your dog or something? So but at the time I was like, why don't you want me to tell you everything you've done right in your books? Anyway, so he asked me a couple of questions. He's very personable. And then he basically said, oh my God, you were a carrier aviator on aircraft carriers. And I'm like, well, I was a backseater. And he's like, tell me everything. He's like, I build models of aircraft carriers. I'm fascinated by them. And his toss-off comment was, I've often thought they're the closest we have to big spaceships. And so I jokingly said, oh, maybe I should write an aircraft carrier sci-fi novel. And Gillian Redfern, who was sitting behind me, said, I'll buy it. So that's like puzzle piece 1. So then years pass, and I'm reading this book because I constantly read history, like straight history, not historical fiction. Like, here, this is what I'm reading right now.
Amazing.
Yeah. So about pre-modern intelligence collection systems, right? This is what I do. So I was reading a book on the Venetian long-range trade system. So this is Venice, 1450. They have these gigantic galleys, and they send them all the way to England and Flanders, you know, out of the Mediterranean. You don't think galleys in the Atlantic, right? And how exactly they collect their cargoes, and this amazingly almost socialist system of selling cargo space.
Wow.
Anyway, to me, totally fascinating. Could bore the crap out of you. Anyway, so I'm reading that book. This is just before COVID. My family decided they wanted to go see a movie called Little Women. And we all read the book together. Fabulous book. So I'm like, sure. So we are sitting in the movie theater, and I have a theory, digression 2000. I have a theory that art makes art. That I've noticed this many times, that when I have a roadblock in my writing, I go to an art gallery or the ballet or the opera or a rock concert or whatever. And while that's happening, something goes on in my brain and I come out the other end solved.
Yeah.
And so my little statement is art makes art. And a really good friend of mine, sometimes mentor, who's a ballet professional, she says the same thing. She says, oh yeah, it's not dance. I don't go to other dance. I mean, she does, but I'll look at paintings or do something completely different, and in the middle of it I see that thing that I'm doing wrong and I get it. So art makes art. So I thought Little Women was a fabulous movie, but there is a particular scene, and I could describe it if you care, but in the middle of the particular scene I had my character and the whole novel. It just went poof. Boom. And it has the aircraft carrier, and it has the Venetian long-range trade, and some planets that I don't know where the hell they came from. and female protagonist. I've never read a female written a female protagonist before, but that was probably the Little Women bit. And I don't know, bang, it was there. And I sat down and wrote it in 45 days. Like I just wrote it and wrote it and wrote it. I could not stop writing.
Yeah.
And another thing about me, I write for money. I don't pretend. So I never write a book until I've sold it. And this time, for the first time in my life, I wrote the whole book. I had to write it. It was like being infected with a disease. I could not stop writing. When I was done, I sort of sat on it for about a week, and then I mentioned it to Gillian Redfern, and she said she'd look at it, and then she bought it like 5 days later. So I guess it's okay.
Apparently so. Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah. So it's like long range trade, intricate, I think pretty well thought out details of how large scale space travel works. Huge ships with 10,000 people as a crew, and awesome. 8.5 kilometers long.
Yeah. Sounds cool.
Traveling for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. That's amazing. I'm looking forward to reading it. The cover had me instantly. I love that sort of that style of sci-fi art where it's just something just lingering against the light of the sun in the background. I just think it's great. When does that hit shelves? When can we expect to read it?
June 2021.
June 2021. Put it in your calendars, people.
And as an additional teaser, because I haven't told anyone this,
exclusive.
Yeah, two exclusive things. So the background is that humanity has found one other alien race, and in 200 years of trading with them, they've never had a conversation. They just can't connect. And there's a reason, and the book is partly about the reason and about solving the reason. And that's pretty fun, I think. And then the other thing is that there's like a gigantic archaeological murder mystery on a galactic scale that hasn't even come home to roost at the end of the first book. But like wherever humans go, they find ruins. It's apparently of a civilization. They're gone now. What the hell happened?
Exactly. I like it. I feel you're building up for books 2 and 3 and 4 and etc.
No, I see this as 2 books, bang and bang.
Yeah. Oh, fair enough. Yeah. No, I look forward to that then. Yeah, like I said, we'll get the covers up and show it off because the artwork is awesome. And yeah, 2021 can't come sooner. Hopefully, because then it'll just be the end of 2020 as well, which would be quite nice.
Can I tell you a sad truth about me? Actually, I'd like to give it to everybody right now because I love feedback. I love it when readers, every reader who writes to me says like, I'm sure you don't have time to read this. Au contraire.
All that I do. Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, I have time to read it, and I actually like to believe that people are reading stuff, right? Don't you have this feeling, Ben? Like,
yeah, all the time.
Yeah, and you go like, oh God, somebody actually read my book. So writing a book and then not having it come out for 16 months or whatever, especially a book that I kind of threw so much into, is kind of, oh, come on.
Yeah,
just put it out there.
So close. Yeah.
Anyway, it will be out in time for us to talk about it while we're sea trout fishing after Glasgow.
That's the plan. Glasgow 2021. That's the next con. Hopefully, yeah. Thank you so much for doing this, Christian. This has been great, and this is exactly one of the things I'm trying to do this year, just to help people get closer to people, the authors that they read, and have something to watch, and just a conversation, like a podcast they can tune into. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on the lounge.
You're a great host, and I hope we can do this in person in the not too distant future.
Absolutely.
With or without cameras, maybe with more alcoholic drinks.
Absolutely. Well, just before we go then, Christian, tell you what, let us know where we can find you online and where we can get your books and all your alter egos.
Okay, so you can go to my website, which is myname.com. So Christian Cameron Author. ChristianCameronAuthor.com. There it is. I'm quite proud of my website. A guy named Rob McClellan maintains my website. He's incredible. And so I just want to give him a shout out. Yours too?
Oh yeah. I work with Rob ever since you recommended him in Dublin.
Okay. Well, he has literally changed my career. So that I owe to him. And also, I just think it's a good website. Like, it's easy to get through, and you can read free stuff, and there's some free maps and downloads and some pictures that of unillustrated books. So good times. And my latest book, I'm writing Against All Gods, which is about fantasy Bronze Age. Just finished Artifact Space. Got a historical coming out in the spring called Hawkwood Sword. And I think the last two books I have out are Bright Steel, the last book in the Cold Iron trilogy. And wow, it's hard to remember. I have written too many books. The Last Greek about Philopoemen of Achaea is my last historical novel. There we
Amazing.
go.
So much to dig into.
Up to date. And you can just go to that website, christiancameronauthor.com, and see every book I've ever written and press a link button that will automatically, no matter what country you're in, take you to the appropriate seller.
Isn't it great?
Because of Robert McClellan.
That's it. Technology. Well, awesome, Christian. Thanks so much again for joining us in the lounge.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
This has been fascinating. Great to chat to you.
Great to chat to you too. Take care.
Cool.